The real reason why Marilyn Monroe's husband didn't go to her funeral. Marilyn Monroe was born Norma Jean Mortensen on June 1, 1926, in Los Angeles, California, emerged as one of the most iconic and recognizable figures of the 20th century. Her journey from a troubled childhood to becoming a global sensation is a tale of both immense achievement and profound personal struggle. Though her fame reached stratospheric heights, Monroe's life was marked by both triumphs in Hollywood and deep-seated tragedies that she struggled with behind the scenes. Her story is emblematic of the golden age of Hollywood, where dreams were made and shattered under the intense spotlight of fame. Monroe's early life was shaped by considerable instability and emotional hardship. Born to Gladys Pearl Baker, Monroe never knew her father, and her mother's mental health issues, including schizophrenia, made her incapable of caring for her daughter. This tumultuous family situation led Monroe to spend most of her childhood in a series of foster homes and orphanages. From a young age, she experienced abandonment, loneliness, and neglect, which profoundly impacted her emotional development. These formative years left her with an overwhelming need for stability and love, and she often sought validation and affection throughout her life, both personally and professionally. The absence of a secure family environment likely fueled her lifelong insecurities and desire for approval. Despite the challenges of her upbringing, Monroe began dreaming of stardom at an early age. She idolized film stars and imagined herself escaping her harsh reality by becoming one of them. To avoid returning to the orphanage system, she married James Doherty, a factory worker, at just 16 years old. Although this marriage provided her with temporary security, Monroe quickly realized that her ambitions extended far beyond domestic life. She craved independence, fame, and the glamour she saw on the silver screen. After Doherty left for military service, Monroe began working in a munitions factory, where her stunning beauty was discovered by a photographer, marking the beginning of her transformation into a model and, eventually, an actress. Monroe's career took off in the early 1940s when she started modeling for various photographers. Her natural beauty, combined with her magnetic presence, caught the attention of modeling agencies, and she soon graced the covers of several magazines. Her modeling success led to her being signed by 20th Century Fox in 1946. Initially, her film career started slowly, with Monroe cast in small, often unremarkable roles. However, she was determined to break into Hollywood, and her persistence paid off. By the early 1950s, Monroe began landing more significant roles in films, gaining widespread recognition for her work in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, 1953, and How to Marry a Millionaire, 1953. These films showcased her as the quintessential blonde bombshell, a character she would become closely associated with throughout her career. Monroe's image as the ultimate Hollywood sex symbol became solidified with her role in The 7-Year Itch, 1955. Particularly the scene where she stands over a subway grate in a white dress as the wind blows it up. This moment became one of the most iconic images in pop culture history, symbolizing Monroe's mix of innocence and sensuality. However, as her fame grew, so did the expectations placed upon her to embody this carefully crafted persona. Monroe felt trapped by the industry's fixation on her appearance, which often overshadowed her talent and aspirations. She was pigeonholed into roles that highlighted her beauty, and she yearned to break free from this typecasting. Despite her public persona as a glamorous sex symbol, Monroe struggled privately with intense insecurity. She was deeply unsatisfied with the superficial roles she was given and longed to be recognized as a serious actress. To combat the image of her as merely a dumb blonde, Monroe took matters into her own hands. She moved to New York and enrolled in the prestigious Actors Studio, where she studied method acting under Lee Strasberg. This decision marked a turning point in Monroe's career, as she sought to reinvent herself by mastering her craft. Monroe worked diligently to improve her acting skills and challenge the public's perception of her. She began to demonstrate a more nuanced and emotionally complex side in films like Bus Stop, 1956, where she played a singer with dreams of escape. Her performance earned her critical acclaim, proving she could take on more demanding roles. Monroe's career-defining moment came with her performance in Billy Wilder's Some Like It Hot, 1959. In this comedy, Monroe showcased her comedic timing, charisma, and depth as an actress, a departure from the roles that had previously defined her career. The film became an instant classic and is still considered one of the greatest comedies ever made. Monroe's portrayal of Sugar Cane, a vulnerable yet witty and lovable character, earned her widespread acclaim. She won the Golden Globe for Best Actress, finally receiving the recognition she had long sought. Her success in Some Like It Hot demonstrated that Monroe was not just a pretty face, she had the acting chops to match her undeniable star power. Yet, even as she reached the pinnacle of her career, Monroe's personal struggles intensified. Her public success masked deep-seated issues, including battles with depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. Monroe's insecurities were exacerbated by failed marriages, first to baseball legend Joe DiMaggio and later to playwright Arthur Miller. Both relationships, while passionate, were fraught with difficulties, with Monroe's need for emotional support often clashing with her husband's expectations. As she dealt with career pressures, Monroe's mental health worsened, leading to erratic behavior on film sets and increasing reliance on medication. Tragically, Monroe's life was cut short on August 4, 1962. When she was found dead in her Brentwood home in Los Angeles. The discovery of her lifeless body sent shockwaves through the world, as Monroe had become an iconic figure, beloved by millions. She was found by her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, who had sensed something was wrong when Monroe failed to respond after locking herself in her bedroom. The immediate aftermath was chaotic, with news outlets scrambling for information, and the public reeling from the unexpected loss of one of Hollywood's brightest stars. Her death, ruled a probable suicide by overdose, came as a devastating blow, yet it ignited years of speculation and controversy that continue to this day. The official report from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office stated that Monroe had died from an overdose of barbiturates, leading to the conclusion that she had likely taken her own life. Yet, this explanation never sat well with many, fueling endless conspiracy theories. Some have speculated that Monroe's death was the result of foul play, suggesting that she was murdered to silence her due to her alleged romantic entanglements with powerful figures such as President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Robert Kennedy. These rumors have persisted, despite no conclusive evidence ever emerging to support such claims. Over the decades, investigators, writers, and fans have dissected the circumstances of her death, pointing to inconsistencies in the timeline of events, missing evidence, and the actions of those closest to her. Others believe that Monroe was a victim of her own demons, suffering from depression and an increasingly debilitating dependence on prescription drugs. The mystery surrounding her passing has only added to the intrigue of her legacy, with numerous books, documentaries, and films delving into the tragic final hours of her life. At just 36 years old, Monroe was gone, and the world was left to mourn a woman whose life had seemed both enchanted and cursed. Her image, carefully crafted by the Hollywood studio system, was that of a glamorous and carefree sex symbol, but beneath the surface, Monroe struggled with deep personal issues. She battled feelings of inadequacy, abandonment, and loneliness, stemming from a traumatic childhood spent in foster homes and orphanages. Despite achieving a level of fame and adoration that few could imagine, Monroe yearned for something more profound, whether it was true love, lasting happiness, or simply a sense of stability in her life. In her final years, she had become increasingly isolated, with her relationships and career faltering as her mental and physical health deteriorated. While her image remains frozen in time as a symbol of beauty and vulnerability, her life and death continue to evoke complex emotions in those who admired her. One of the more perplexing aspects of Monroe's passing was the conspicuous absence of one of her former husbands, playwright Arthur Miller, at her funeral. His decision not to attend was long viewed as an act of coldness, an apparent indifference toward the woman he once loved. However, a newly discovered, unpublished essay by Miller sheds new light on his reasons for avoiding the funeral and offers a deeper understanding of the emotional torment that surrounded Monroe's final days. Miller's essay, written just 3 days after Monroe's death, is a raw and scathing critique of the public mourning spectacle that followed her passing. In his words, he offered a damning indictment of the mourners themselves, many of whom he believed had played a role in Monroe's downfall. "Let the public mourners finish the mockery," Miller wrote. a phrase that reveals his deep disdain for the hollow grief displayed by many in attendance. He didn't see the funeral as a place for genuine mourning, but rather as a continuation of the exploitation and objectification that had tormented Monroe throughout her life. To him, those weeping and appearing devastated at her death were often the same individuals who had profited from her pain and beauty, contributing to the personal demons that eventually led to her untimely death. Miller's decision to stay away from the funeral was not, as some have long assumed, an act of apathy. Instead, it was an emotional protest against what he saw as the hypocrisy of Monroe's mourners. He claimed that many of those gathered around her casket were the very people who had participated in her destruction. His essay articulates an accusation so profound that it suggests he saw Monroe's death not as a tragic accident, but as the inevitable result of systemic mistreatment by Hollywood, the press, and those who fed off her fame. Most of them there destroyed her, Miller wrote, a powerful statement that speaks to the deep resentment he felt toward the forces that had used Monroe as a commodity rather than recognizing her as a person. Miller's stance is in stark contrast to that of Joe DiMaggio, Monroe's second husband, who was famously inconsolable at the funeral. DiMaggio, the former baseball star, was devastated by Monroe's death, and his grief was visible to all who were present. He leaned over her casket, kissed her lips, and whispered, "I love you, I love you." DiMaggio reportedly never got over her death, and for the rest of his life, he made sure that fresh red roses were delivered to her grave 3 times a week. His public display of affection was seen as the ultimate testament to his love for Monroe, and it contrasted sharply with Miller's absence, which seemed to reinforce the perception that he had been emotionally distant and indifferent toward her during their marriage. Yet, Miller's unpublished essay reveals a deeper, more complex relationship with Monroe than the public had understood. While DiMaggio's gestures were undeniably romantic and heartfelt, Miller's intellectual and emotional response to her death was rooted in a broader understanding of the forces that had overwhelmed her. He recognized the exploitation and abuse that Monroe had suffered at the hands of Hollywood executives, the media, and even some of her so-called friends. In his essay, Miller drew a direct line between Monroe's mistreatment and the way women in the entertainment industry continue to be exploited, a prescient observation that resonates with the contemporary #MeToo movement and the Harvey Weinstein scandal. The parallels between Monroe's experience and the stories of sexual harassment and abuse that have emerged in recent years are striking, and Miller's essay reads almost like a prophetic condemnation of the toxic culture that has long pervaded Hollywood. Miller's reflections on Monroe's death go beyond personal grief. They're an indictment of the very system that had chewed her up and spit her out. Monroe's beauty, charm, and vulnerability had made her a star, but those same qualities had made her a target for abuse and manipulation. As Miller wrote, she was destroyed by many things, and some of those things are you. This statement suggests that Miller viewed Monroe not simply as a victim of her own personal struggles, but as a casualty of a much larger, more insidious machine that dehumanized women for profit and entertainment. Monroe's tragic death has often been framed as the result of her personal battles with depression, addiction, and loneliness. However, Miller's essay shifts the focus from Monroe's internal struggles to the external pressures that crushed her spirit. By accusing the mourners of contributing to her death, Miller was calling attention to the way Monroe was treated as an object of desire and fantasy rather than as a person with her own needs and vulnerabilities. His decision to boycott the funeral was not a sign of indifference but rather an act of defiance against the hypocrisy of those who pretended to care for Monroe in death while having contributed to her suffering in life. In the end, Arthur Miller's absence from Marilyn Monroe's funeral was not about a lack of love or compassion. It was about his refusal to participate in what he saw as a public spectacle that trivialized her life and death. His essay reveals a man who was deeply affected by Monroe's death, but who could not bring himself to join the mourners he believed had helped drive her to despair. For Miller, Monroe's funeral was not a place for genuine grief but a continuation of the exploitation that had haunted her throughout her life. His unpublished essay offers a rare glimpse into the mind of a man who, far from being cold and indifferent, was wrestling with the profound injustice of Monroe's fate and the role that society had played in her demise. At Marilyn Monroe's funeral, the contrast between the intimacy of the proceedings and the overwhelming public spectacle outside was striking. Only 31 mourners were invited to attend the service, reflecting a close-knit group of those who had been closest to the star in life. Yet outside the cemetery, a much larger scene was unfolding. A crowd of 500 people gathered at the gates, along the cemetery walls, and even on nearby rooftops, hoping to catch a glimpse of the event. This throng of onlookers represented the public's intense fascination with Monroe, even in death. The atmosphere outside was both mournful and chaotic, as her fans sought some form of closure. To maintain order amid the swelling crowds, 100 policemen were deployed, assisted by studio security officers. Their presence ensured that the area around the cemetery remained controlled, although the emotional charge in the air was palpable. The sheer contrast between the quiet, somber event inside and the bustling, restless crowd outside encapsulated the dual nature of Monroe's life. One that was intensely public and scrutinized, even in her most private moments. Arthur Miller, Monroe's third husband, was notably absent from her funeral, a decision that puzzled and even angered some at the time. Miller later explained his absence with a quote that revealed his emotional exhaustion and distaste for the media frenzy that he knew would surround the event. To join what I knew would be a circus of cameras and shouts and luridness was beyond my strength, he said. His words convey the deep disillusionment he felt, not just with the spectacle surrounding Monroe's death, but also with the media's treatment of her throughout their marriage. For Miller, attending the funeral would have been an act of futility, as he believed it would be reduced to a photo opportunity rather than a genuine act of mourning. He expressed that it was meaningless to stand for photographs at a gravestone, emphasizing that the presence of cameras and journalists would detract from the personal significance of the moment. In his eyes, Monroe's funeral had been transformed into a media circus, and Miller, a deeply private and introspective person, simply could not bring himself to participate. This refusal to attend has been interpreted by some as Miller's way of distancing himself from the chaotic spectacle that surrounded Monroe's life and death. As one commentator put it, Miller didn't want to be part of this circus that would develop around her funeral. His decision may have been shaped by the intense scrutiny their relationship had endured from the very beginning. When Miller and Monroe's romance became public, after nearly a year of secrecy, it was ridiculed in the press. The media dubbed them the Egghead and the Hourglass, a reference to the intellectual playwright and the glamorous movie star, mocking their union as an unlikely and almost farcical match. One magazine went so far as to call it the most unlikely marriage since the Owl and the Pussycat, further trivializing their relationship. The relentless mocking was a sign of how much Monroe, even in her personal life, was reduced to caricature by the media. There were also lingering rumors over the years that Miller may have had ulterior motives for marrying Monroe. Some suggested that he had married her for her wealth, or even for the publicity, as a way to deflect criticism following his refusal to cooperate with the House Un-American Activities Committee during the McCarthy era. These claims have been refuted by scholars and those close to the couple, but they reflect the skepticism with which their relationship was viewed at the time. However, an essay by Miller, a fragment of which was made public when the University of Texas at Austin acquired a private archive of his papers, offers insights into his true feelings. The essay, photographed by the New York Times, may help to correct some of these impressions. Professor Christopher Bigsby, a renowned biographer of Arthur Miller, insists that the playwright had been genuinely in love with Monroe, despite the public's perception. Bigsby has stated that Miller was completely bowled over by her. According to him, it was undoubtedly a love affair. In fact, one of Miller's letters to Monroe reveals an almost adolescent-like outpouring of affection, a reflection of how deeply infatuated he had been with her. Bigsby describes the letter as an almost adolescent outpouring of love, demonstrating the emotional intensity Miller felt for the actress, especially during the early days of their relationship. However, the problems between Monroe and Miller were rooted in a common issue many couples face. They both entered the marriage with idealized images of each other. As Bigsby explains, both of them went into this marriage believing something about the character of the other person which turned out not to be true. While this disillusionment is not unique, it was exacerbated by Monroe and Miller's public personas and the media scrutiny they faced. Monroe's vulnerabilities, exacerbated by her fame, clashed with Miller's intellectual and idealistic nature. Although their love was real, it was not enough to sustain their marriage, and both eventually realized that their visions of each other were not aligned with the reality of who they were as individuals. In stark contrast to Miller's intellectual and emotionally restrained approach, Monroe's second husband, Joe DiMaggio, had a much more tumultuous relationship with her. DiMaggio, a baseball legend, had been physically abusive towards Monroe during their marriage, a fact that has since been romanticized or glossed over in popular memory. Bigsby points out that Joe DiMaggio used to beat her up. The darker side of DiMaggio's love for Monroe often went unspoken in public, but it was well known to those close to the couple. One particularly brutal incident occurred when DiMaggio slammed a suitcase on Monroe's hand, breaking her thumb. Despite this violence, Monroe found herself torn, as there was another side to DiMaggio that she could not entirely let go of. As Bigsby explains, part of her still clung to DiMaggio because of the other side to him, the man who would send her roses. This dynamic, where DiMaggio would vacillate between affection and brutality, confused and hurt Monroe, but like many who suffer from abusive relationships, she found it difficult to sever the emotional ties completely. In a gesture of devotion after her death, DiMaggio ordered flowers to be placed at Monroe's grave, forever. For 20 years, he had a dozen roses delivered to her resting place 3 times a week, a lasting symbol of the complex and contradictory nature of his feelings for her. However, in 1982, 2 decades after her death, DiMaggio finally stopped ordering the flowers, ending this ritual that had been a poignant link to Monroe. His act of ordering the flowers had been romanticized in popular culture, a symbol of enduring love, but it also served as a reminder of the complicated and painful relationship they had shared. 40 years after Monroe's funeral, in 2002, Arthur Miller invited Professor Bigsby to his home, where they discussed Monroe. In a moment that highlighted how Monroe's memory still lingered in Miller's life, he took Bigsby to the garage of the house where he had once planned to live out his days with Monroe. There, hanging on the wall, was an object that seemed frozen in time: Monroe's bicycle. Her bicycle. It's been hanging up in there for 40 years, Miller said, a quiet testament to the enduring presence of Monroe in his life. The bicycle, untouched for decades, symbolized both the fragility and permanence of Monroe's impact on those who loved her. Though their marriage had ended, and though they had both moved on, this small, seemingly mundane item represented the depth of Miller's connection to her, a poignant reminder that despite everything, Monroe had left an indelible mark on his life. In the end, the funeral of Marilyn Monroe became a reflection of her life itself, a mixture of public spectacle, personal tragedy, and unresolved love. The stark differences between the ways Miller and DiMaggio mourned her illustrate the complexity of her relationships and the way she was perceived both by those closest to her and by the world at large. While the media and public viewed her through the lens of glamour and scandal, the men who loved her grappled with the memory of a woman who was far more than the sum of her public image.